At first, the surprise is not what these dogs look like. It is what their DNA refuses to hide about a single word: Mastiff. If guardian dog genetics fascinate you the way they fascinate us, hit subscribe now, because what their DNA reveals next changes how you'll look at every protective breed you've ever met. In a 2024 study indexed in PubMed, researchers examined 304 livestock guardian dogs, compared them with 2,183 modern dogs and 22 ancient dogs, and found something that complicates the old idea of a single Mastiff origin. The signal was broader, older, and more tangled than a simple family tree. These guardian dogs shared ancestry, and they carried extensive gene flow across modern breeds. That means the story is not about one pure line preserved intact in time. It is about layers that kept meeting, mixing, and leaving traces behind. That matters because the traits we recognize in guardian dogs do not appear by accident. Heavy bodies, calm readiness, a frame built to confront pressure without collapsing into panic. Those qualities can look like a visible signature of the breed, but the deeper record sits underneath, in variants that survived because humans kept selecting dogs that could stand between danger and what had to be protected. A flock, a gate, a child asleep near an open yard, a farm at the edge of silence. And the most unsettling part is this: the Mastiff ancestry pattern is not confined to one famous breed or one ancient icon. It appears as a genetic inheritance running through guardian populations that were shaped again and again by usefulness. The dogs were not merely chosen for size, they were refined for function. Over generations, the same kind of body became valuable because it worked. The same steadiness mattered because it saved time, animals, and sometimes lives. So when the DNA archive turns to Mastiff ancestry variants in guardian dog DNA, it is not chasing a decorative label. It is following a biological clue that still speaks. Some of these dogs seem modern on the surface, yet their genomes preserve older instructions, as if the past never fully left the kennel, the pasture, or the line of breeding records. The inheritance is not abstract. It is written into resistance, posture, and the capacity to hold ground when a threat approaches. That is why this evidence changes the question immediately. The real issue is not whether guardian dogs once had Mastiff influence. It is how deeply that influence was kept, redistributed, and preserved, while humans kept asking the same animal to do the same hard job in new places and new centuries. And if you want to see how far that biological memory reaches, stay with the trail. Because once the shared ancestry becomes visible, the next question is no longer where these dogs came from, but why certain Mastiff-derived traits refuse to disappear. Before the Mastiff ancestry pattern can make sense, one older certainty has to give way. For years, the story of canine origin was often told as if it moved in a clean line, from one center, one source, one explanation. But a 2010 analysis of more than 48,000 SNPs in dogs and wolves, led by Robert Wayne's laboratory at UCLA, unsettled that picture. According to PubMed record 2023-7475, the breeds carried a greater proportion of multi-locus haplotypes unique to Middle Eastern wolves than to wolves from East Asia. That detail mattered because it contradicted the earlier hypothesis that had favored East Asian wolves as the main source of domestic dog diversity. The conflict was not a footnote. It exposed how fragile the simplest origin story had always been. If the genome was already pointing toward a stronger relationship with Middle Eastern wolf haplotypes, then the foundation under every later claim about pure descent became less stable. What had looked like a single route suddenly resembled a corridor with more than one entrance, and more than one memory trapped inside it. Before we go further, if a link to more of this material shows up in the description and in the first comment, that is where the deeper breakdown lives, with more of the guardian dog record laid out piece by piece, worth having open while the rest of this unfolds. That is why a later 2016 genomic and archaeological study, also on PubMed, took the discussion even further by proposing a dual origin for domestic dogs instead of a single simple one. PubMed record 2725729 did not merely add another theory, it widened the frame. It suggested that canine history may have been shaped by separated populations, later contact, and long movement across regions, leaving behind genetic traces that do not line up neatly with one founding event. For the question of Mastiff-derived variants in guardian lineages, this historical contradiction is decisive. It means the DNA of protection breeds is not reading like a clean family tree. It is reading like overlap, return, and preservation under pressure. A robust body, a steady response, a frame built for vigilance. Those traits did not appear in isolation. They survived because breeding kept selecting them, but also because canine history itself was never a straight road. And that is where the investigation becomes more intimate. Once the old origin debate is reopened, the focus shifts from abstract ancestry to the animals that carried it. Not every line held onto the same inheritance in the same way. Some populations were pulled toward speed, others toward companionship, and others were repeatedly asked to stand at the boundary between danger and shelter. If you have been following this trail, stay with it, because the next layer is not just about where domestic dogs began. It is about how certain lineages retained ancient strength while being shaped into protectors, and why that memory still lives in their DNA. When the Tibetan Mastiff enters the frame, the question stops being abstract. In a 2023 genomic study of native breeds from the Korean Peninsula and East Asia, this giant guardian was not positioned as a simple local relic. It was found to be mostly tied to West Eurasian ancestry, a result that sharpens the entire investigation because it shows a Mastiff line carrying an older signal that does not dissolve into one neat regional origin. The breed's body may have been shaped on high ground, in cold air, and under human pressure for control and defense, but its DNA preserves a deeper root than the surface would suggest. That is the first confirmation, and it matters because it changes the weight of the evidence. The Tibetan Mastiff is not only a name attached to size and presence, it is a living record of how Mastiff-related variants can remain detectable after generations of breeding, movement, and selection. In other words, the traits that made this dog valuable for guarding did not arrive as decoration. They stayed because they were useful, and because the line itself kept carrying them forward even as new populations were folded into the story. The same study adds a second layer that makes the timeline feel less like folklore and more like a map with edges. The divergence of East Asian dog populations from a common ancestor was estimated at roughly 2,000 to 11,000 years ago. That is a wide window, but it is still a window, and inside it the movement of guardian lineages becomes easier to imagine. A population can split, shift, and adapt, while still preserving the biological memory of a protective frame. A dog can be resettled, traded, refined, and still keep the ancestral architecture that once helped it stand between danger and a flock, a homestead, or a human family. This is where the Tibetan Mastiff becomes more than a celebrated mountain breed. It becomes evidence that selection for guard work does not erase ancestry. It can conserve it under new conditions. The heavy build, the steady response, the sense of territorial alertness, and the physical confidence associated with these dogs fit that logic exactly. They were not assembled from nothing. They were edited from older material, and the old material did not vanish just because a later generation needed a better sentinel. Here is where the pattern gets even sharper, because the Tibetan Mastiff is not the only guardian line carrying an ancestry that refuses to fit a single region. The same kind of layered signal shows up across other protection breeds too, and walking through those cases side by side, with the specific gene regions involved, is exactly the kind of thing gathered together in the material available in the description and the first comment. Which breeds carry the deepest Mastiff signal, how that signal maps onto working ability, and what it means for anyone trying to trace a working dog's real lineage instead of the version printed on a pedigree. If you follow that thread closely, the implication is hard to ignore. Some guardian dogs were not merely descended from Mastiff-like forebears in a loose cultural sense. Their genomes still point to a lineage in which protective function and inherited form remained welded together. And once that becomes visible, the whole category of guard dogs looks different, not as a collection of breeds defined only by work, but as a biological archive in which ancient strength survives in measured, traceable fragments. That is why this Tibetan example lands so strongly in the larger inquiry. It confirms that the Mastiff signal is not theoretical, not decorative, and not confined to the past. It is present where the need for vigilance was intense enough to preserve it. Stay with that idea, because once one lineage reveals the pattern so clearly, the next question is no longer whether the signal exists. It is how many other guardian lines are still carrying it, hidden in plain sight. The first thing that changes is not the dog, but the way the evidence behaves. A name that once looked like a historical marker now appears again as a working genetic signal, and that changes the scale of the story. In 2008, the Tibetan Mastiff was already being read through mitochondrial DNA, with 2,525 base pairs sequenced across cytochrome B, tRNA-THR, tRNA-Pro, and the control region. That is not a casual glance. It is a careful extraction of identity from the body itself. Years later, the same breed returned in a different register. In 2026, a study of FGF5 variants found that 22 Tibetan Mastiffs, despite showing a visibly long coat, carried none of the 5 previously known long-hair variants on record, which led researchers to identify new variants explaining the trait. That second finding matters because it shows continuity in practice, not just in memory. The breed is still useful for locating specific genetic marks, still capable of revealing how an inherited trait travels through time and remains visible in living animals. That is the deeper turn. The Tibetan Mastiff is not standing in this investigation as a frozen relic, preserved only because people admire its silhouette or its reputation. It continues to function as a genetic reference point, one that links ancient lineage to an observable trait in the present. A long coat becomes a clue. A mitochondrial sequence becomes a ledger. Together they show that the record of selection is still active inside the breed, and that the breed itself is still speaking in details. And once that becomes clear, the question sharpens. If one guardian line can carry a readable signature across decades of scientific attention, then the broader family of protective dogs may be holding similar messages in other parts of the genome. The continuity is no longer abstract. It has dates, loci, sequences, and individuals attached to it. It has a body, a coat, a lineage, and a trail that can be followed without guesswork. Before we move into the last stretch, if you are finding this useful, take a second to subscribe and drop a comment with which guardian breed you think is hiding the strongest Mastiff signal. It genuinely shapes which lineage gets traced next. Stay with that trail, because the next layer is not simply that these variants exist. It is that their persistence forces a new interpretation of guard dogs as living archives of function, not just descendants of old working stock. Their genomes keep receipts, their traits keep returning, and the more closely we look, the less likely it is that protection, endurance, and form were ever separated in the first place. What finally breaks the old story is not a single dramatic mutation, but a pattern repeated across datasets, regions, and centuries of breeding. In the 2024 analysis of 304 livestock guardian dogs, 2,183 modern dogs, and 22 ancient dogs, led by researcher Diogo Coutinho Lima at the University of Porto's Cibio Institute, the animals that looked most anchored to one inherited line also carried evidence of exchange with dogs outside the guarded flocks. That detail matters because it undercuts the comforting idea of purity. It shows that the strength of guard dogs did not depend on sealing them off from the rest of the canine world. Their abilities endured while genes moved, mixed, and settled into new combinations. Seen from that angle, the contradiction becomes the key. Isolation was never the engine. Function was. The dogs kept their size, steadiness, and readiness, because humans kept choosing those traits whenever protection had to be reliable. The genome did not freeze. It adapted under pressure from work. That is why a guardian dog can remain recognizably suited to vigilance even while carrying ancestry from different lines and different places. The protective role acted like a filter, preserving what mattered and letting the rest drift around it. The older evidence pushes the same conclusion farther back. A 2020 study led by geneticist Anders Bergström at the Francis Crick Institute that sequenced 27 ancient dog genomes showed that all dogs share a common ancestry, distinct from modern wolves. It also found limited gene flow from wolves into dogs after domestication, but substantial gene flow in the opposite direction, from dogs into wolves. That asymmetry is important. It tells a more braided history, one in which canids did not remain neatly separated after domestication, but kept interacting in ways that left traces in both directions. The past is not a straight corridor here, it is a crossing, and in 2025, when researchers reanalyzed 2,693 published dog and wolf genomes to investigate local ancestry and gene flow, the same broad picture remained visible. Ancestry is layered, regional, and difficult to compress into a single line. That larger framework gives the guardian dog story its final weight. The variants associated with Mastiff ancestry are not isolated trophies from a vanished past. They are part of a living genetic record that survived because the work itself kept demanding them. So the real answer is not that guard dogs came from one untouched ancestral mold. It is that selection by people repeatedly held onto a useful biological package, while that package kept traveling through time, geography, and mixture. A herd had to be protected. A territory had to be watched. A human family needed a body that would stand between danger and what mattered most. In that setting, the genes tied to Mastiff ancestry were preserved because they were useful enough to be carried forward again and again. That is what makes the conclusion so revealing. These dogs are not just descendants of old working stock. They are evidence that heredity can be practical, memory can be functional, and ancestry can remain visible without remaining fixed. The genome keeps the record even when the line is no longer simple. The body keeps the habit even when the history is complicated. And the guardian dog, in the end, becomes something larger than a category, a living archive of protection shaped by selection, mixture, and endurance. If you look at them now with that history in mind, their presence feels different. The mass of the shoulders, the calm before a threat, the refusal to waste movement, all of it reads like inheritance made visible, not a relic, not a frozen symbol, a working lineage that kept its purpose while the background shifted. That is why these variants matter so much. They explain how a dog can carry ancient Mastiff ancestry without losing the present tense of its job. And maybe that is the quiet power of the whole story. What survives is not only bloodline, but usefulness shaped into identity. If this kind of canine history leaves you wanting to trace the next hidden layer, subscribe and share this with someone who loves working breeds, because the deeper these genomes are read, the more clearly they reveal that survival in dogs has always been tied to memory that still works.